Through the years 9000 to 6000 BC, the Mesopotamians were living in sedentary villages practicing part-time farming while still gathering and hunting. This 3,000-year span of time is also about 150 generations. Each village contained only a small number of families. Each family lived in a small mud hut containing a single room. Since the surrounding land is vacant, a family can freely choose its plot, and just as the Canela do, an entire village can easily move every few generations as land becomes worn. The first permanent villages occurred around 5500 BC and contained 300 persons. Population levels remained steady. By 5000 BC, irrigation canals were used to bring water to crop fields, and this results in a crop surplus. Irrigation turned out to be the key to abundance. A single storage room filled to the top with grain can feed thousands of persons for months. The construction and maintenance of irrigation and storage systems requires mutual efforts and the management system that is a chiefdom and then state. The number of canals increased until they crisscrossed much of Mesopotamia. These are the canals near the city of Umma. For 1,500 years, these farmers lived in abundance and stability, and their population grew. An irrigated plain has many small villages. A village moves to the top of a forming hierarchy because of its location or size. Soon, the top villages of a larger region form a multi-tiered hierarchy. This is the more complex political unit of the first chiefdom, and it has a centralized redistribution center controlled by a single ruler. The farming villages of the Mesopotamian foothills region now formed ranked societies with privileged positions and leaders. Villages grew into city-sized urban centers containing 3,000 persons by 3500 BC. The first urban area classifiable as a city may have been Uruk. The people of the first cities had to invent the urban ways that are still very much the same in any city anywhere around the world today. Brand new occupations occur, including craftspersons, carpenters, and shopkeepers. City dwellers soon learned to locate living areas away from craft and manufacturing areas. The people of the first cities were also the first to encounter disease caused by large populations around waste and decaying food. Until 100 years ago, many cities let freely roaming pigs control the trash problem. In 3000 BC, Mesopotamia was still the only region in the world to have cities. There were no cities in Egypt, India, China, America, or Africa. Mesopotamia was the only civilized area of the world and so exported the idea of civilization to the surrounding areas. The strange sight of a city would have gathered hunters spreading rumors from one band to the next all the way across the continent. By 2800 BC, small villages occur along the equator from the Indus to the Aegean. But Mesopotamian chiefdoms have become states with monumental architecture, state religions, and labor taxes. There were several independent city-sized states between the Persian Gulf and modern-day Baghdad. Cities grew in population and area by expanding their irrigation system to increase cropland. Many tablets record the promise of leaders to expand the irrigation works. These states had populations of 30,000 persons by 2700 BC and 300,000 persons by 2000 BC. Each city is necessarily fed from crops grown in its surrounding area, which typically extends 15 kilometers or 10 miles. As neighboring cities grew outward in size, their surrounding areas began to overlap, producing arguments about bordering farmlands, water, and canals. Cities began arbitrating between the arguments of other pairs of cities in short-lived political unions. Such squabbles were recorded in the tablets for several generations before any intercity argument had brewed into a major fight. The first artistic depiction of warfare occurred around 3200 BC, but it was not a common theme until 2500 BC. While holding a bureaucratic position in an early cooperative around 2300 BC, Sargon of Akkad got the idea that an empire could be created. Sargon was the first of us humans to think of forcibly uniting the cities of a region. Having no empathy for other human beings, Sargon sought benefits for himself by directing the cruel murder of thousands of other persons, by chopping off arms, legs, and heads. Such is the character of every would-be conqueror throughout history. Before Sargon, it had not occurred to a person to conquer neighboring cities to extract payments or attempt to be emperor of the world. Such wars of mass murder had never before occurred in the history of our species, which had been unaware of the destructive power that could be harnessed from thousands of people directed by one psychopath. Such leaders have ordered the salting of farmlands or the diversion of a river to destroy a city and kill its people. Normal human beings don't think this way. Only emperors commit mass murder for personal gain. They are not the heroes of history. It took some 5,000 years, which is the first half of human civilization, for Mesopotamian farming villages to grow to population levels of a few 100,000 persons. These farming villages lived in peace for 5,000 years. No war occurred throughout this time period. War is not in human nature, and it is not a permanent part of civilization. Our first ever emperor somehow convinced his people that it will be glorious to go to another city and kill hundreds and even thousands of persons. Imagine what would have been your reaction to the news of the first ever massacre of thousands of persons. It is no coincidence that this is the time in which religion becomes moral instruction. Our most important spiritual leaders, including Moses, Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad, emerged soon after the development of large, stranger-filled cities, empires, and wars of mass murder. Our moral leaders re-emphasized our love for each other and our golden social rule. After the first emperor existed, many other kings said, "What? You can do that? I want to have an empire just like him, only bigger." War was invented to create empires. A few generations after the first empire wars, people had already come to assume that war has always occurred, but actually, war has existed only through the second half of civilization, and war has always been the idea of our leader seeking to expand his own wealth and power for his own benefit at the cost of terrible deaths for other people by tearing away arms, legs, and heads. In each region of the world, empires grew in size and duration up through the last century. Once you've seen one pattern of sloshing kingdoms and empires, you've seen them all. The so-called winning army was simply the largest army. The purpose of government, ever since the first chiefdoms, has always been to organize our mutual efforts. Together, and with such leadership, we accomplish civilization. But the newly invented emperor demanded that we kill and be killed so that he can expand his empire. Bronowski and Maslish point out that a person will not come to your home and say, "I must kill you for your food to feed my children." We all agree that this person's lack of food is no excuse for such immoral behavior. But some kings believe that morality does not apply to them and will kill to obtain territory, raw materials, or any other object of interest. For the last 5,000 years, we have let rulers answer to no one while causing much death. We, the human beings of the world, now tell our leaders that we will conduct no more war. Our nature is to be loving and nurturing parents, not mortal combatants as a favor for kings. Love and children, not empires, stir our being.
Cabeludo. Tava mais pra cá. Pode mandar o citocina aí, meu amigo. Tá não. Sim, aqui. Tem que estar no solo. Faz assim. Exercício de coxa branca, como que é? Que é pra apavorar pra cima. Contar, né? Coxa. Não, isso aqui é pra assustar o paciente, né? O paciente aqui tá tudo vermelho, ele começa a ficar tudo vermelho. Você sabe, isso aqui tá acontecendo. Mostra aqui o documento pra sua mãe. Tem documento. Cadê o saco, rapaz? Isso não tem saco.
We, the human beings of the world, don't care about being emperor. That does not stir our emotions, but children do. War is not innate human behavior, but love is. We love our children. They drive our very existence. We will do anything just to see them smile. We devote every effort of our lives to the well-being and nurtured growth of our children. We see that we are not yet fully in control of our political leaders when they continue their 5,000-year-old habit of going to war on a whim as they hope to expand their own wealth and power through the terrible death of other people. Family members might have their limbs blown off while eating at the dinner table. In the last century, war kills more civilians than combatants. For example, in just the first Gulf War, several 100,000 human beings were killed. Most were civilians, of which half are children. The next time your leader promotes war and mass murder, simply say no, because it means the murder of thousands of children. Some political leaders seek power through war and do not care that it means the death of 100,000 people. Do you know how to end war today? Fill the television with images of people screaming and crying because their arms have been blown off and their child's legs have been severed. Do you know how to keep a war going once it has started? Keep these images off the television. The price of such a terrible lie is a terrible death for innocent people. War and its injustice will occur only for as long as we let our leaders demand it, and only for as long as we go along with them. For too long we've been letting leaders cause murder. We, the human beings of the world, now agree that the nations of the world must immediately capture and imprison any leader who causes an attack on people in his region or in any other region. There's no reason for us to conduct war with that leader's military. This causes large numbers of terrible deaths. We will instead arrest that leader. Our would-be emperors can instead live together in one prison. Of the 7 billion of us today, only a handful are dreaming of world conquest through war. We, the human beings of the world, tell our leaders that we will no longer conduct their wars. We will not let a handful of leaders start war and kill millions of persons this century. We now choose to glorify nurturing and kindness, not war, violence, and profit. Rather than just outlawing guns for the public, let's follow the Dalai Lama's advice and take guns away from every army. In fact, let's remove every army from our planet. Our most selfish leaders will then be less deadly. What purpose do guns and armies serve today? Mostly they prolong injustice. As the first group of 100,000 of us head to live on Mars, will we have to take armies, guns, and bombs with us? For what purpose? To protect us from aliens or from the conquest-minded leaders? Of the $1 trillion spent on tanks, planes, and ships throughout World War II, 10% of this money was the business profits that went to a few hundred persons who owned most of the stock of a few dozen war companies. Despite Eisenhower's warning, U.S. military spending has increased such that it now spends as much as does the rest of the world combined. Through the last 50 years, the U.S. military has conducted actions in 50 of the 200 nations of the world. No other country does this. U.S. politicians constantly state that they should choose the leaders of other nations. This makes people mad at the U.S. While campaigning for president in the year 2000, George W. Bush said that foreign policy is easy. Just stop doing things that make other nations mad at us. A few years later, he said that great nations go to war. With the $1 trillion spent on the Iraq War, the U.S. could have instead funded complete health care and education for all 80 million of its citizens under the age of 21, spending $12,000 for each of them. The people of the U.S. do not have affordable health care or college. Instead, our leaders choose to spend our mutual money on a really big military force. In 2015, U.S. military spending was $0.6 trillion, which is the same money that all 50 states spent on K-12 education for 50 million students attending 100,000 public K-12 schools. The leading cause of suicide among combat veterans is guilt from having injured or killed another human being. The Emperor does not care about soldiers, victims, guilt, or the misery of others. To avoid wiping out their own species, two members of a species do not normally fight to the death. If each encounter resulted in the death of 1 out of 2 participants, then there would soon be none. One day, if a group of 100 members paired up and fought to the death, then only 50 would be left alive. After the next day's fight, there would be only 25, then 12, 6, 3, and 1. In 1 week, the species would have murdered itself. Any species that does fight to the death will soon be gone. DNA knows not to fight to the death. People don't normally fight to the death either. In fact, they can't, because people have no lethal canines, claws, or horns. The lack of lethal anatomy shows that, for millions of years, we have not been fighting to the death. Killing with bare hands is a rare thing. A weapon must be used. In the U.S. today, 2/3 of murders are committed using a gun. In most of the world, 1 person in 100,000 commits murder. But in our most unjust cities, the number can be 1 in 10,000. If 8 billion persons paired up one day and fought to the death, then 4 billion persons would be left alive. The next day, if those persons paired up and fought to the death, then there would be 2 billion left alive. After pairing up for just 33 days in a row, there would be just 1 person left alive, because 2 raised to the 33rd power is about 10 billion. Our DNA knows not to fight to the death. Gatherer-hunters were marrying their neighbors, not murdering them. Gatherer-hunters don't conduct war in which an entire group is murdered, because soon there would be no groups left. Only emperors wipe out the residents of entire cities. Gather-hunters have few possessions, so there are no spoils of war to be taken. The goal of a war party might be just to make scary sounds outside another village all through the night. If caught, sometimes a kidnapping or murder would be committed. If human beings were murderous by nature, then we would have wiped out our own species long ago. Only a tiny portion of us have so little empathy that we can harm another person. It is not okay for the good guys to commit murder. What did Sargon's invention do? Throughout the 2,500 years following Sargon's empire, the amount of irrigated farmland decreased. Wars disrupted society and impeded the repair of the canals. A dark age occurred from 1600 BC to 1300 BC, in which trade nearly disappeared and people once again grew their own food. As local empires and self-seeking leaders constrained some regions of the world, other regions advanced civilization. Soon, 100% of us will be contributing to our mutual progress. In the ancient world, royal women were sometimes used as pawns to cement relations through international marriages. For example, the widow of Tutankhamun asked the Hittite king to send a royal prince to serve as a king of Egypt, but the prince was murdered before he arrived. The Assyrian Empire attempted to squash a rebellion in Israel by forcibly moving the rebels to Assyria and keeping them there for a few generations. This resulted in the lost tribes of Israel. More recently, Stalin used this approach to move Chechens away from their homeland for a few generations. And China used the reverse technique in moving millions of people from China into Tibet to outnumber the original people.